Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your time today. My name is Brad Colpitts, and I work in the School of Policy Studies at Kwansei Gakuin University's Sanda campus. I also have my doctorate of education focused on post-secondary leadership. And today I'm going to be talking about enabling leadership to spur innovation in higher education and English language learning, principles and practices for the new academy. I want to start with this great quote from Jeffrey Buehler and his book, Change Leadership in Higher Education, and that is, "Until the pain of doing nothing becomes greater than the pain of doing something, most people will continue to do nothing." I think this really characterizes my own experience in higher education here. And that is, a lot of people are invested in maintaining the status quo, and we need principled ways of addressing that and spurring innovation and change in our own departments and organizations. I'm going to start today talking about airplanes, actually, funnily enough, just as a means of illustrating the importance of leadership in terms of fostering better and more adaptive organizational culture, and how poor leadership can also have negative impacts on organizational outcomes. I'm then going to turn to leadership and talk about what it is and isn't. I'll look at some challenges in higher education, both globally and in the Japanese context, and then turn to some practices to inspire innovation in your departments or institutions, and some effective leadership skills and attributes, particularly based on my own doctoral research, and then look forward to some of the challenges I expect we'll face as higher education instructors and leaders, etc. And I'll also offer you some resources and readings if you want to peruse them and study a little bit more. So I'm going to start with a story about airplanes. This was actually just by coincidence in February. I was watching Netflix and I came across this documentary, which I thought would be sort of relevant to today's discussion. And the documentary is called Downfall: The Case Against Boeing. As you know, Boeing is an American airplane manufacturer, and they've been the market leader in that industry for many years, many decades. And they sort of built this strong company culture and the success of their company based on the values of safety and strong staff input on design and development of airplanes. What happened in 1996 is Boeing merged with another American airline manufacturer or airplane manufacturer. And this sort of prompted a real big change in the company culture. Whereas previously the leadership and the engineers and people designing the planes and ensuring quality had a very close working relationship. After this merger occurred, the company became much more bottom line or fiscally oriented. And you also saw that the leadership was actually physically moved outside of the area where the planes themselves were being manufactured. So in the late the 1990s and early 2000s, Boeing started to face greater competition from Airbus, which of course is a European airplane manufacturer. And this put a lot of pressure on them to innovate. Airbus was getting ready to release a new plane, and Boeing really had nothing ready to sort of compete with this. So what they ended up doing is actually repurposing a former plane and just adjusting it slightly, giving it a new name. But this was really pushed on the engineers, with little respect given to or thought given to the safety and performance of the plane. And of course, this plane has become somewhat infamous, the Boeing 737 MAX. As you know, in 2018 and 2019, this plane was or different Boeing 737 MAXs. There was two crashes, one in Indonesia, the other one was in Ethiopia. Of course, this resulted in the tragic loss of 346 lives. But it had some really big consequences for the company as well. They had billions of dollars in lost revenue, and it really just destroyed their reputation. And rather than accept responsibility for it, the leaders further sort of pushed the blame on the pilots. It actually turned out this was a software problem. And again, this sort of connected to how the company culture had devolved, that they hadn't found this earlier. So this really demonstrates how poor leadership can have, sometimes even drastic or really negative outcomes like this. And it's true in the airline industry or the airplane industry, and it's also true in higher education. So let's talk about leadership. What is it and what is it not? So leadership theory is a really robust field of academic research that dates back more than a century. And it sort of began with great man theories. And these looked at leaders throughout history and sort of sought to identify the common characteristics or attributes they had that made them so successful as leaders. But what we've come to realize in the past 50 years is that leadership is not really something you're born with. It's a skill that can be trained or taught. And one great definition I like of leadership is from Amanchuku, who says, everything a leader does that affects the achievement of objectives and the well-being of employees and the organization. And while I do like this definition, I don't think it really encapsulates leadership in its totality. Because we've come to understand that leadership is not just something that occurs from formal leadership positions. In the higher education context, that would be deans, directors, etc. There's also informal leadership, so leadership that occurs within an organization. Faculty might take leadership positions or leadership actions and get involved in decision making. So, of course, going back to that quote, that sort of challenges this idea that leaders or leadership comes from these formal leadership positions. There's also the growth of systems leadership theory, and this looks at organizations as really interconnected systems, and each agent, be it a faculty member, an administrator, a dean, even a student, can really impact the leadership throughout that organization. And what one person does has ramifications for other agents or nodes within those systems. We've also come to understand, as I've already alluded to, that leadership is a hybrid process. So you have people in formal leadership positions doing leadership or taking leadership actions or making decisions, but you also have leadership throughout an organization. And sort of an interesting point in the literature that you find is that the majority of decision-making occurs at the middle management level, not at that executive level. So what middle managers decide has a much greater impact on us as faculty and our departments. And in higher education in particular, leadership occurs on a rotational basis. So you're seeing leaders coming in and out for set periods, and then they're either moved to another department or or perhaps move to another position. And what this means is that a lot of these leaders don't necessarily have the leadership training or skills to excel in these roles. Instead, because they excelled as researchers, instructors, and mentors, they get these positions, but doesn't mean they're necessarily prepared to do the job they're given. So in higher education, transformational leadership has come to be known as the dominant paradigm. And I'll speak to this a little bit because it was the leadership theory that sort of informed my own doctoral research. And sort of the torchbearer of leadership theory at present is this full range leadership model from Bernard Bass. And it looks at leadership on this scale. This is a nice interpretation of it, looking at it from most passive to most active and most effective to least effective. And Bass identified three leadership constructs. The first is passive avoidant forms of leadership. So when you think of a passive avoidant leader, a laissez-faire leader basically just demonstrates the absence of leadership. They take no leadership action. Then you have a management by exception passive leader. This is someone who takes action after a problem has occurred. You have transactional forms of leadership. This includes management by exception active. These are leaders who take action in anticipation of a problem, or transactional contingent reward leaderships or leadership approaches. And this is leaders who adopt sort of the exchange of reward or punishment for good or bad performance. And finally, this dominant paradigm in higher education is the transformational leader. And this is a leader who articulates a collective vision, involves followers in decision-making, and stimulates them intellectually, among a number of other characteristics and sort of attributes. And this is sort of the one that has become dominant in our understanding of leadership theory in higher education. So turning towards global and Japanese higher education challenges, we know we now live in the knowledge economy. For those of you who aren't familiar with this term, this just suggests that the economy now is predicated on the development of intellectual properties, patents, inventions, etc., and less so on the exchange of tangible goods, as was the case in the industrial economy. And as a result, we're seeing the growth and the changing role of universities from just being hubs of knowledge diffusion to being sort of core engines in spurring economic growth. And in East Asia in particular, you're seeing the adoption of global rankings as proxy indicators of success of initiatives to reform higher education. My apologies, I might pause this recording briefly just to get a drink of water. So what was interesting is in 1992, from 1992 to 2004, you saw the growth or the number of institutions growing by 35%. HEIs means higher education institution. I'll use this acronym in the presentation later. At the same time, we saw the number of high school graduates decrease by 39%. This is really important because these graduates account for about 95% of new entrants into Japanese universities. And at the same time, you saw the use of a brand name of these institutions, or the name of these institutions, as a filter for employers to decide who they hire. So with 48% of institutions now under their intake capacity, that means that a lot of institutions have had to lower academic standards in order to attract enough students. I know some institutions in Kansai have 6 or 7 entrance exams, which is kind of silly, but their hope is to attract students who don't get their first or second choice of institutions. And yeah, resultantly, we're just heading into a situation now in 2020 where the number of high school graduates is set to decline again, where it's just not fiscally sustainable to maintain things as they are. Another big kind of issue here in Japan and globally, obviously, is the digital capacity of institutions. LMS usage, or learning management system usage, in private universities in Japan is at about 20%. At local public universities, it was 60%. And at national public universities, it was 80%. Compare that to the UK or the US, where penetration was almost 100%. This is in about 2017. And that's problematic because in Japan, private institutions are responsible for teaching about 75% or 3/4 of students in the country. Another major change driver, of course, is internationalization. I'm sure you're familiar with the Global 30 project, as well as the Top Global University Japan project. And one of the big challenges for Japan is, if you look at the OECD average, the percentage of international faculty is about 20% and 7.8% for students. Compare that to Japan, it's about 4% and 2.9% respectively. And what that means is, though we could attract international students to sort of fill up those intake numbers, or those quotas, we don't really have the capacity in our institutions to teach these students, because somewhat surprisingly, one study by Aizawa found that 66% of international students in Japan want the ability to study in English. And I think change resistance is just sort of something that's ingrained in universities more broadly, maybe more so in Japan, where you have these strong hierarchies. And we've also seen the emergence of the new academy as a means of addressing that. But is it successful? And what is the new academy? So the new academy, this term comes from Boeing in 2005, who defined these 5 pillars of HEIs that were prepared to meet the needs of the net generation. There was the interplay of culture and technology, and how technology is having a greater effect on our societies and how we teach. There's a multi-dimensional framework for action. This is in terms of how we make decisions in higher education and implement those decisions. Changing cultural values. I mean, this is even more relevant, I think, now in 2022, with all the madness that has occurred over the last few years. There's demand for a new style of leadership, and the changing relationship between learning and space. I won't really speak to this, but this is just thinking about how we use space in our institutions to teach. But in speaking to that leadership point, the hands-off leadership style that has sort of existed in universities traditionally just doesn't really suit itself to the dynamic change that's required. This was obviously put on display during the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of connects to some of the things I talked about with digital capacity, et cetera. We just weren't prepared to engage with this change, and this change is going to accelerate. So we need leaders that are adept at meeting this change. So I want to talk about some sort of practical things, practical practices that leaders can take to inspire innovation in their own institutions. So why don't we engage in more innovation in higher education? Well, I think a big part of that is it entails some degree of risk, and people are a bit risk averse. So the first thing we need to do is to embrace enabling leadership. And these are leaders who sort of enable their institutions to quickly adapt and meet the changes that present themselves. And part of that is allowing more decision-making throughout an organization, reducing bureaucracy, things like that. And Rogers provides this great model. If you want a really empirically validated, clear way of implementing innovations in your own institution, this is a way of doing it. And what Rogers prescribes is that we find a heterogeneous group of people within an institution or an organization. These should be influential people, people who are opinion leaders, people who are likely to adopt an innovation, and also people who have some degree of commonality. This could be in terms of language is really important, but also in terms of field of study. And by using this group of people to sort of test drive or be the quote unquote early adopters, as you can see in the graph here, with an innovation, that innovation is more likely to spread and take root in an organization. If you're interested in this, I would recommend reading Roger's articles on this subject. We also need more accountability for our leaders and faculty. To the credit of my own supervisor right now, one thing that she does is gets a regular annual or biannual feedback from her staff about how she can do her job better. I really think that's a great way of sort of assessing how effective we are as leaders, and vice versa. I think it's good to give faculty feedback as well. We need to know how we're doing. Otherwise, how can we really improve or sort of participate in innovations that are taking place in our institutions? Another thing is engagement. We have these, and this sort of connects to my next point about meaningful feedback. We administer these student surveys every year in my institution. I think this is pretty common in most institutions, but is the feedback really meaningful? What do we get from that feedback, and how can we improve on it and engage our stakeholders, be they students or faculty, et cetera, and use that feedback to improve our organizations. Another big one is building bridges between faculties. Some literature speaks to the silo effect. Everyone is sort of siloed within their own faculty and doesn't really know what's going on in other faculties. And I think this also sort of inhibits innovation from spreading from faculty to faculty. Leaders should be the ones facilitating this sort of opportunity for different members of different faculty to engage. I can speak to my own context. One interesting story was I was at a student fair where international students and Japanese students have a chance to meet. I took my students there, and on the sidelines of that fair, I had the opportunity to speak with a professor who was responsible for teaching international students. And what we found is he had a demand for his students to interact more with Japanese students. And on the flip side, we had a need for our students to engage in more authentic English practice with international students. So through that just chance meeting, we were able to facilitate sort of a formal contact between my department and his, and it allowed our students to meet these needs. Our students had chances to practice speaking English with international students, and international students had the chance to meet local Japanese friends, which I think is a really key part of their desire to study in Japan, or for anyone really to study abroad. And then the last point here, of course, is improving communication. I'll speak to this a bit more. It's funny how it seems like such a simple thing to do, but it just doesn't happen. And again, when it comes to feedback, when it comes to building bridges between faculty, communication is really key. And I think this is something that leadership really needs to focus on in their own department and between departments as well. So talking a little bit about my own doctoral research, and this sort of connects to effective leadership skills and attributes. I conducted this study for my doctoral thesis entitled Leadership Models for Internationalizing Higher Education Institutions in Japan. I looked at effective leadership approaches and practices for internationalizing Japanese higher education institutions. I had 162 participants, 35 were Japanese, 127 were non-Japanese. They were all based in EFL. So this sort of limited the generalizability of my findings, but I also think EFL is a key component within this transition of institutions, because a lot of us on top of being researchers, we're also pedagogists. And I think there's opportunity there for us to engage with other faculties and help develop the pedagogy in our institutions, and also to be a bridge between that international component of our institutions and the domestic component, and try to bring that together and make them less segregated, less isolated. Anyways, I had these respondents, 162 of them, take a survey that was connected to the full range leadership model, looking at their leadership preferences. And what I found was the non-Japanese group had a higher preference for transformational leadership. This corroborates findings that have been found in the private sector, comparing Japanese and Western contexts, and my respondents were largely Western. I also had conducted interviews with 10 of the participants from the first 162 person group. And from that, I had some other relevant findings. So I conducted something called magnitude coding. And magnitude coding is really looking at the frequency of words as they appear in the transcripts that I collected. In particular, I was looking at words they use to describe effective leaders. And from these words, I came up with 7 categories. The number one most cited thing throughout the transcripts was communication skills, as I've already talked about. The second was vision. The third was decision-making, which referred to the quality and rapidity of decision-making. The fourth was effective personality characteristics. This included things like being knowledgeable, influential, energetic, approachable, etc. There were effective personality characteristics, being caring, supportive, diplomatic, thoughtful. There was the leadership approach, which included embracing risk, which, again, kind of connect this all together, goes back to my first point about innovation and risk, not being manipulative and being hands-on. And then leadership skills included things like being well qualified and being able to solve problems. And it's sort of interesting that these top 3, the 3 most cited leadership skills or attributes I found in my own study sort of align with another similar study done in 2003. I'll put that in the references down there. But this study was adopted by the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and they sort of used it as a basis for creating their own leadership training program. And sort of interestingly, the staff there, the faculty there, and it was a much larger sample size. I think it was several hundred at least. They also identified these 3 skills as being among the most salient points when identifying strong leadership. And another thing I found was my respondents gave me some solutions they thought to improving leadership practices in their own departments. One thing, again, was improving communication. This helped develop relationships in their faculties, and it also helped leaders understand faculty beyond their CV. This is sort of interesting because the leaders and the faculty I interviewed both said they wanted more opportunities to communicate, but just said that there was various reasons, mostly time and job demands, that sort of inhibited this from happening more often. And it sort of connects to the idea of building rapport. They wanted more opportunities for informal exchange. And the nomikai came up. This is, sort of interestingly enough, this has also come up in other studies. But of course, some people just don't like that nomikai atmosphere. So casual lunches and coffees were also an option. Building intercultural cohesion. Again, speaking to my own experience, I have been in, several faculties at least, 2 or 3, where the Japanese and non-Japanese teachers were sort of separated from each other, which seems kind of silly when you're teaching the same groups of students. Very counterintuitive. So one thing they talked about, my respondents talked about was providing more language support for non-Japanese faculty and students. Keep in mind that even though language educators are the largest single group of non-Japanese faculty in Japan, probably the biggest single groups of by nationality would be Chinese or Koreans. And they also talked about building work groups, balancing different strengths and weaknesses. These could be linguistic, these could be related to skills, these could be related to experience, but building work groups that sort of alleviate the weaknesses of certain individuals within that group to accomplish a given goal or project. And the last point that kind of came up was embracing diversity. I know this word gets pushed around a lot. It's a bit of a buzzword, but when I mean diversity, I mean that just having a diverse work group or faculty allows for the empowerment of differing viewpoints and sort of improves the quality of decision-making. This is something my respondents cited, but has also been cited in the literature quite extensively. And it's particularly in English language learning context, there's a desire to eliminate the native speaker versus non-native speaker duality. We have this idea that people or positions are either geared towards native speakers or Japanese teachers of English, and this sort of ignores this third group of educators that are neither native speakers nor Japanese nationals, who are very well qualified and can help sort of boost the quality of teacher or faculty in our institutions. So kind of looking forward now, what are the big challenges we're going to face in the coming years in the near future? I think one of the key things obviously we've experienced over the last 2 years is that there's going to be more demand for blended learning. I know there is a certain element, particularly in language classes, that requires a face-to-face component, but I found that a lot of students actually did enjoy having some of their classes delivered entirely or partially online. We can also use blended learning functionalities to sort of boost the quality of learning outcomes we have in our classes. We're also moving from a unidisciplinary to a multidisciplinary world. So leaders have to facilitate more opportunities for students to study different areas of expertise, because we don't really need people who are focused solely on one subject. We need people who have a wider range of skills they can apply to their work contexts. Campuses will necessarily have to become more multicultural. Like I said, the sustainability of Japanese higher education institutions just isn't there if we don't bring in more students from overseas. And we're going to need more multicultural faculty to teach these incoming students as well. And we also need the other components in place, the capacity throughout the institution to sort of support these students and these new faculty and potentially leaders. We talk a lot about lifelong learning, but we don't talk about long life learning. As people are growing older, there's a great book, which I have here in my resources at the end. As people are living longer and with sort of the disruption of technology and changing how our society works, we're going to need to change how we teach, or how our higher education systems work, so that people can come back and skill up and then re-enter the workforce later in life, because they may just not have the skills to meet the demands of the workforce 20 or 30 years after graduating from college. And as they live longer, people are going to have to also work longer. I think technology is going to bring a lot of opportunities and challenges. One thing we don't talk enough about in terms of opportunities in higher education is big data. Like I said, we have all this data running through organizations, but we're not really utilizing it intuitively to improve how we teach or how we deliver our course content or programs. So looking into that. There's also adaptive learning opportunities, so software that helps us tailor our teaching and learning to the individual student. It helps teachers in that respect. And I think especially as EFL instructors, one of our big challenges now is going to be the ability of technology to enable cheating. I know many of you may be familiar with DeepL, which produces translations which are nearly as good as a native speaker could write. So sometimes they're indiscernible. We have to look at ways to address that. And again, of course, it's important we do this as individuals, but we need leaders to facilitate this so these become institutional policies, not just happening from individual faculty members or individual departments. There's also this need to train more adept leaders, which I'll speak to next. So how can we train effective higher education leaders? We need to engage leaders in principled continuous training. When I say principled, I mean has to be rooted in science. There's a huge leadership training industry, particularly in the United States. It's estimated that industry is now worth about $346 billion, but the results don't really reflect the efficacy of the training thus far. There's also a demand for globally competent leaders more broadly in the Japanese context. Yonezawa called this a crisis because a lot of Japanese leaders don't have the sort of global experience or intercultural skills to lead Japanese organizations outside of Japan. This, of course, has implications for the economy. And in the higher education context, there are some initiatives taking place to address this dearth of leadership in higher education. One example is at Tohoku University and its Asia Education Leader course. This is only for graduate students, unfortunately, but it brings together students from Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China to look at boosting their research skills and sort of developing or fostering the leadership skills they'll need to become leadership or effective leaders in the future. But in the meantime, we need to bolster the leaders we already have. Again, I talk about Nanyang Technological University's Leadership Academy. I would highly recommend that you look into this. This university is now one of the top 10 young universities globally, and also one of the most diverse universities globally. And this is largely in part due to this Leadership Academy they instituted with the University of Chicago, Illinois. And their training included things like discussion between different current and future prospective leaders. There was role plays, and there's also case studies. Again, this is a huge amount of information to discuss in one go. And I know I've kind of had to rush through this a bit just to make sure we get through this in the 30 minutes that are allotted to me. But I would encourage you to read more. I've put together a list of resources and reading that you can peruse at your your leisure. These include some books related to leadership, to higher education more broadly, and to leadership both within and outside of higher education. Just follow that QR code. Finally, I'd like to say thank you very much. I apologize if I ran through this a little bit quickly. Again, I was just trying to meet the time. It's been tough over the last couple of years to really connect. So I would invite you to reach out to me here via either LinkedIn. You can find me as Brad Colpitts, or on Google Scholar or ResearchGate as Bradley D.F. Colpitts. Thank you very much. And I now would like to open the floor to your questions.